Good evening. I'm Corvallis Advocate Assistant Editor Emily Ratcliffe, and co-moderating with me tonight is publisher Steve Schultz, who also serves as president of the City Club of Corvallis. Welcome to tonight's CITYSPEAK Forum. These forums are co-presented by the Corvallis Advocate and the City Club of Corvallis. The Advocate offers fresh news daily online, these town hall meetings, and just recently brought back the same broadly ranging weekly events calendar it had been publishing before the pandemic. Our co-presenter, the City Club of Corvallis, is a volunteer-run nonprofit organization that seeks to present a diversity of viewpoints and constructive dialogue. Steve?
Thanks, Emily. Partial funding for these forums come from Peak Sports and First Alternative Natural Foods Co-op. However, we could not present CITYSPEAK without support from viewers like you. Please consider a subscription. Visit our site. There are levels at $10 or $15 monthly. Over and above donations are, of course, welcomed. Folks, locally run outlets like The Advocate have become exceedingly rare, and community members willing to sustain these news outlets are rarer still. We're grateful for all of the subscribers we've had and the donors that we have. You make everything that we do possible. We feel really quite validated by all that support. So thank you. It really means quite a bit to us on a number of levels. For those of you that are not yet subscribers, please consider joining the group of people that are. It takes a whole 60 seconds on our website. It's just really quite easy to do. And then you get unlimited articles every day you want to read to your heart's content. You can read whatever you want. Currently, you only get 3 weeks, so it's not a bad deal. It's a pretty good deal for you. Okay, Emily, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. So tonight we're focusing on OSU's forests. Notably, beyond our local McDonald Dunn Forests, the university will be expanding its work to the Elliott State Forest as well. Our panelists include Tom DeLuca, Dean of the College of Forestry, Katie Kavanaugh, Associate Dean for Research, Holly Ober, Associate Dean for Science Outreach and the Program Leader for Forestry and Natural Resources Extension, Shannon Murray, the Program Director for the Elliott State Research Forest, Stephen Fitzgerald, Professor and Extension Specialist, as well as Director of the College of Forestry Research Forests, and Ken McCall, member of the Department of State Lands Elliott Advisory Committee, and also a member of the College of Forestry's Research Advisory Committee. If you, as a viewer, have questions for our guests, we welcome you to comment on our Facebook posting of the live stream event, or to email us at cityspeak@corvallisadvocate.com. Again, that's cityspeak@corvallisadvocate.com. So Tom, let's actually start with you for questions. Okay. How many students does the College of Forestry have now, and what sorts of fields do they generally go into?
I'm sorry, Emily, could you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. How many students does the College of Forestry currently have, and what sorts of fields do they go into?
Yeah, so we have about just over 1,000 undergraduates and about 250 graduate students. So close to 1,300 students in the college. And they go into fields ranging from forestry to forest engineering and operations to natural resources and a host of areas within the natural resources, such as restoration ecology, urban forestry, general resource conservation. And then we also have students that are studying tourism, recreation, and adventure leadership. And then we have a degree program in the wood science and engineering, which is a wood, they have a new name for it. It was renewable materials up until just the other day. But anyhow, so we have degree programs in wood science and engineering, and those individuals may end up working, students from across our degree programs may end up working in agencies such as Forest Service, BLM, state lands, fish and wildlife, or they may wind up with private industry, working in either forest operations, and management, or perhaps in the milling operations and the generation of wood products. We also have students that go into consulting, private consulting, or into working for nonprofit or non-governmental organizations. And we have a lot of students working within parks, both state, national, wildlife, and local parks. And I don't know what all I've missed, but I think I've generally covered the gamut. We have a diversity of faculty working in the college, including everything from engineering, sort of forest engineering, forestry, forest management, forest ecology, as well as a range of social sciences within recreation management, human dimensions of resource management. We also have forest policies, soil scientists, hydrologists, and of course, wood science and engineering, and who knows what I left out, but a diversity of faculty that provide mentoring of graduate students across the gamut of the natural resources.
Well, and with all of these different areas and fields too, what kinds of impacts would you say the college has on society in general?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. Our students leave here and go to work in managing our public and private lands, and which is a huge responsibility in terms of the sustainable management of our resources and the management of our wild places, whether it's wilderness rangers or park rangers or park managers. These are our students end up influencing the going into research or going into forest sciences or wood science research, natural resources research, and advancing our understanding of ecosystems, how they function, and how to manage those ecosystems to achieve meeting human resource needs while minimizing our impacts on the environment. I feel like our students are really play an important role in a sustainable future for our country and beyond.
Looking at the college now and into the future, as well as maybe by extension forestry in general, what do you perceive as the biggest challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, that's great. We have some really significant challenges on our doorstep, don't we? I mean, we're faced with climate change and all the uncertainty that's associated with climate change, and that means, we have flash droughts, and we have shifting wildfire realities that we're having to adjust to. We have influence on short-term issues like heat domes, as well as long-term issues like shifts in pest pressures that exist across our ecosystems. And so we have these ecological challenges that are associated with climate change, but we also have a host of challenges associated with human demands on resources in terms of the demand for wood resources is increasing lockstep with population growth. And so when we start to look at how that, trying to avoid producing locally to preserve lands, we end up exporting those challenges to somewhere else in the world that may have weaker environmental laws. So we have challenges associated with that. We have social challenges with the social license to conduct forestry. There's a lot of current concerns around forestry, and some of it, valid in terms of we always have to be pushing ourselves to be better, and we're actually driven by a code of ethics that says we have to always strive to do better and base it on the best science. And so there's that pressure, but there's also as we become more and more of an urban nation, we're over 80% urban, a greater percentage of the population isn't familiar with forestry or the practice of forestry or the importance of forests for that matter. And we have a significant challenge with ensuring that our populations understand the value of forests for the multitude of values that they bring society, whether it's recreation, clean air and water, or the resources that are generated from them in terms of wood. And lastly, I'll just mention that we have challenges around social justice and environmental social justice and forest management, and ensuring that our resources and our recreation landscapes are available to the widest percentage of society, and that we aren't building towards a society that limits access by one group or by less, fortunate groups within society. So we have a lot of challenges in front of us, and I'll mention one more before I quit, and that is a general devaluation of scientific knowledge. And our job is to generate science and produce the best science and make that available to society around the forest sciences in particular, but all, in the broadest terms, including recreation and wood science. And there's challenges with communicating science and encouraging and having portions of society believe or not believe in the science that's being generated. And that's yet another challenge. And it's a significant one when you're looking at managing resources that are so valuable to society, but also managing challenges such as fire that influences our, is a threat to our communities, but a natural part of ecosystem function. So finding that balance is another big challenge. So anyhow, we opened a can of worms with that one.
Yeah. Well, and Holly, your role in forestry has to do with research, outreach, and extension. Could you let viewers know what your overarching goals are in that role?
So my position technically is Associate Dean of Extension and Outreach. But then I also have a role in overseeing providing executive oversight for the research forests. So there are two different things there. I'm not sure if you were asking more about my first role or the role specifically with the forests. Were you asking about the forest specifically?
More the outreach and extension piece.
Okay, so the Oregon State University is a land grant university, which means it is expected to do three different things, which is research, teaching, and extension. So research is essentially the creation of new knowledge through scientific inquiry. The teaching is essentially providing education to tuition-paying students. And then the extension outreach is providing education opportunities to the public or to non-paying audiences. And so that is really my role, the extension and outreach. And once we get to talking about the forest, there is a role in the forest for the research and the teaching and the extension outreach.
Well, and what can viewers anticipate for the future in those areas?
Well, as Tom just pointed out, there are many challenges, and the number and severity of those challenges is increasing. And so really on the research front, what our job as a university is to be at the forefront and recognize the challenges that are heading toward us so that we're prepared to start the research that is going to help answer the questions that we're going to be needing to address in the near future. From the teaching side, we need to be preparing students so that they're ready to enter the workforce and have the skills and expertise to be prepared for whatever might come. We don't want to be teaching and preparing for the jobs that currently exist, but be thinking toward what will it be like 10, 15 years into the future, and how do we get folks the knowledge and the skills and expertise that they'll need so that they're ready to deal with tomorrow's challenges. And then on the extension outreach side, we are all about helping solve problems. That's really what extension is all about. Folks who are not tuition paying students coming to us and asking, how can we use science to answer the questions that we've got, and we bring that information to them. So again, it's a matter of us at OSU understanding and looking to the future about what the biggest challenges are going to be so that we're ready to address them. And so I would go back to a lot of the things that Tom mentioned, those big challenges. That's where our attention is on right now.
Thanks, Holly. And Stephen, you've been with the university since the 80s. How have you seen the forest that OSU manages evolve generally? And more specifically, how has recreational use of the McDonald Dunn Forest grown, given that it saw over 155,000 visitors back in 2018?
Okay, thanks. Well, I haven't managed the forest, our research forest, at, for that full length of time, but I've been associated with the college to be able to see how management has changed over time, and also the number of forests that we now have compared to when I first came in the 1980s. So we have back in the 1980s, we had maybe 6 or so forests. We now have 10. And a lot of those came to us from people who were involved in our extension programs. These are woodland owners who had a piece of property and they didn't have any heirs, and they were interested in sustainable management of their forest, as well as using it for extension, outreach and teaching. And so we've been the college has been the benefactor of a lot of those extension programs. And so we utilize what I call our satellite forest beyond the McDonald Dunn Forest as forests that we can use for tours, for research, for demonstration. For the McDonald and Dunn, we've seen a series of management plans that have evolved over time, from one early in the 80s not having a plan to in the early 90s putting together the first plan, and another one in the mid 90s, and then another plan in 2005. And over time, those plans have changed. And we are currently in the midst, Holly's the lead, but we are currently revising our 2005 plan. So I expect to see some changes in the management of the McDonald and Dunn Forest. Probably we'll have that plan done in the end of 2023.
Then are there challenges balancing research, education, and recreation? And if so, what does that interplay look like?
Yeah, sometimes we encourage. I love having people come out in the forest because it's another use that I think doesn't get full appreciation. And what has moved me is that I've had 2 people come up to me during my time here that said that the forest saved their life. And that was pretty powerful. And I think when you look at people recreate or go out in the forest to maybe cleanse the mind and strengthen the body, and it's so important. I know our dean, Tom DeLuca, is always out there every day. But anyway, we have a lot of people who tell us how valuable it is. And particularly during the pandemic, when we had to shut the forest down for about a month, and we got a lot of people saying, oh, please open it, please open it. And when we did, it was just this wonderful response. Like, the forest is crucial to their almost daily or weekly life. And as a result, we get about 155,000 user visits a year, and I expect that'll continue to go up as people move to Corvallis. And so that but it does take a forest can be overwhelmed as well, and so it takes management of people, our trails, our roads, and trying to make sure also our research sites remain intact and aren't damaged by recreationists or creating illegal trails. Sometimes we have that problem. But also we do harvest timber that helps pay for all the infrastructure and pay for the recreation. And so we have to manage people that can't go through timber harvest. So managing that and making sure people understand the importance of the danger that happens if you wander into a harvest unit. So we set up closures to kind of what I call kind of herd people around in a safe way around those harvests. And so that takes quite a bit of management and communication with the public when we do that.
And how have you seen the pandemic impact recreational use of the Mack forests, and how have you seen it impact its management?
I think I think there's been an increase in use, and I don't know if it's just because of the pandemic or just because people, Corvallis is always one of those in the polls, the top 10, college town, and so people move here, and so you see this kind of general population increase, and as a result, you'll see more people trying to access the forest. But I would say that, because of that, our parking lots are usually full, particularly on the weekends, and that's an indicator of their use and popularity. Of course, that also, you have to manage all of that as well. So sometimes there's illegal parking. We've had problems where people are parking and turn around in other people's driveways. And so we've had to do quite a bit of work there to try to manage that and reduce and mitigate that impact to neighbors.
Thanks, Ken. Or thanks, Stephen, sorry. And Ken, we've mainly talked about the McDonald Dunn Forest so far, but we'd like to move on to the Elliott Forest for a moment. So as a member of the Department of State Lands Elliott Advisory Committee, could you share what the history of that forest has been and what the aim of the current transition under OSU management is about?
Sure, and I'm kind of a history buff, so it's a risky thing to ask me about history. The Elliott Forest was initially a break off, if you will, by a huge land exchange between Oregon State and the CITYSPEAK National Forest, wherein all of the acreage that did belong within the boundaries of the CITYSPEAK National Forest south of the Umpqua River became the Elliott State Forest. And the primary goals of the Elliott Forest from its inception were to have a really nice block of consolidated school lands. So these are lands that were traded between Forest Service and state that were common school fund lands, and the objective of the common school fund lands was to present revenue for Oregon schools. So the revenue source obviously was timber. So there's quite a logging history. In reality, a lot of the logging early on was logging of some of the larger older forests that remained from a series of fires in the 17 and 1800s. And over time, the forest has evolved into quite a landscape of both plantations and pieces of older forest, and really a very unique landscape on the central and south Oregon coast. Directly to north, which is the remainder of the CITYSPEAK National Forest, has had a pretty similar history to the Elliott over time in terms of timber harvest, logging, and a lot of recreational use from the get-go. But the current pattern has been a little more recently for the Elliott and a little sooner for the CITYSPEAK, where a lot of the timber harvest was curtailed due to endangered species issues. So both the CITYSPEAK to the north and the Elliott have three kind of major threatened endangered species, listed species, being the marbled murrelet, the coastal coho salmon, and the northern spotted owl. So those species have, to a great extent, guided what's happened on both forests, and particularly on the Elliott in the past few decades. And the state land board, which has administered the Elliott, and the governor pretty much made a decision to try to come up with a plan where we could get some of the harvest going again on the forest to generate some of those funds, because the reality was that the forest was costing in excess of $1 million a year to maintain without any income whatsoever. So the advisory committee was put together with a pretty diverse groups in terms of our backgrounds, in terms of management. So there were environmental groups, there were timber industry groups. I personally belong to a hunting group. We also had folks from the schools and from local communities. A couple of the county commissioners from the Reedsport and Coos Bay area, they're all on the committee. And we've arm wrestled a lot for the past 3 or so years over what kind of a model might come from our efforts on the Elliott in terms of something that can be an actively managed forest, generate some income, and also return some incredibly valuable research back to Oregon and to the world for that matter.
So then now, is there a sense of how much of the Elliott Forest will be used for what? Or, what the Elliott Forest will be used for at this point?
Yeah, and I can give you a rough breakdown, and Katie can certainly correct me, or Shannon, but roughly 2/3 of the overall acreage on the forest will be in reserves. And that is one block of 30,000+ acres on the west side of the forest. And then within what the researchers call the triad research model, there are both intensive and extensive and reserve blocks in the remainder of the forest. And those are scattered over the landscape as opposed to the reserve block that is a block to the west. So if that makes sense, I hope. Otherwise, try a different approach on the question or somebody back me up.
Yeah. Well, and what will the university's overall role be in managing the forest?
The role of the university will, in fact, be to manage the forest. In the past legislative session, part of that legislative session was to complete the decoupling process. The decoupling process means, in simple terms, to remove the lands that are within the Elliott from their obligation to the Common School Fund, and to do that as a research forest. And also a new authority, a new state authority was created to oversee the management of the Elliott State Research Forest, and Oregon State University will be the manager of the Elliott State Research Forest. So it's huge opportunities for both citizens of Oregon and for the forestry school.
And Shannon, what kinds of opportunities does the Elliott Forest bring for research, education, and recreation? And maybe we'll start with recreation first, since the terrain is challenging. It's quite steep with soils regularly moving downward. So will there be trails at some point? And can there be a trail system like the ones for the Mack Forest?
Yeah, and Ken may have some insight on this too from his work in recreation. But as you mentioned, the Elliott is a very different forest than the McDonald Dunn. So it's very steep, and there are limited trails on the forest. There are forest roads from prior management. A lot of those are up along the ridge lines, and primarily a lot of the recreation that happens there right now is people using the forest roads, people looking to hunt, but it's not really an area where you might be able to easily develop a vast trail network. And so as far as recreation with the Elliott State Research Forest, what we're looking to, and this is in the legislation that Ken mentioned, is that there will be separate education and recreation plans developed that will link with the research proposal that was developed, and then also the forest management plan that's in process to look at what the values are for the forest, and then what is possible with recreation and how that balances with management and research.
Could you share how opportunities for research and education might take form?
Yeah, so right now we're working on the forest management plan. We're continuing to collaborate with the advisory committee, people at OSU, as well as with other institutions and agencies. to put together the management plan, which is really the tactical plan or the implementation plan for that research proposal. And so it's using the foundation that was laid in the research proposal, the triad experiment that we've touched on a little bit, which is a mixture of intensive, extensive, or ecological forest management and reserves, as sort of a research platform for the forest that would have other research themes and other research projects nested underneath it. So some of the main research themes that have been developed that we're working on implementation for with the forest management plan are looking at carbon and climate change research, human dimensions and recreation, wildlife and biodiversity, and then aquatic and riparian systems.
And what kinds of timelines are we looking at for those opportunities?
For the, just to clarify, for the development of the forest management plan or for the establishment of the research forest itself?
I'd say development of the plan.
Sure. So the plan is currently in process, and part of that timeline is also in the legislation that just passed this past year. So that legislation lays out that by July 1st, 2023, that there will be an approved forest management plan, as well as several other key parts of the Elliott State Research Forest that will be developed and approved. So right now we've been working on this forest management plan over the course of the past year, and we'll be doing another big push that we're currently in to work on the draft with a presentation to the State Land Board in December of 2022, and then finalizing that plan by June 2023. So very similar timeline to the management plan that's in progress for the McDonald Dunn Forest.
Thanks, Shannon. And Katie, what opportunities for research in the Elliott Forest have you been anticipating the most?
Well, that's a loaded question. I think one of the things that I would emphasize is, rather than specific projects, is the integration of research that will occur on the Elliott. So rather than saying we're just going to do research on biodiversity, carbon, wood production, recreation, each of those as individual silos or something like that. Instead, we see those as an integrated piece that we think that that's really what the Elliott can offer, is not just a single answer to a single question, but into how the answers to those questions that we ask and the results that we get can be integrated in helping to make decisions. So I think that's a key piece of the research overall. But it is really exciting to have a research forest that's coming about at the same time as the technologies are in a explosion of development as well. And so we're looking at being able to monitor things that we've never been able to monitor in a forest over the long term. And that's also a critical piece of this. And because the Elliott was not a research forest in the past, it comes kind of as a blank slate, and we get to kind of start that program in this integrated fashion. So I would say that's what we're really excited about.
And what opportunities in forestry research generally do you think will be especially valuable or the most valuable in the years to come?
Yeah, I think again, I think probably the greatest value is going to come out of development of answers through time. And so many research projects that are done on very short timeframes, because you have funding for 3 years or 5 years. So you run out, you start your measurements, but that timeline in a forest is a fraction of the processes that occur over the life of a forest. And so I think what the Elliott will be able to bring is a long-term perspective of responses, whether it's to climate change, whether it's to harvest and harvesting decisions, whether it's biodiversity and the interactions between climate change and biodiversity and forest harvest, and the interactions with recreation. There's a lot of potential there of understanding how other species respond to recreation. And so I think that over that long-term perspective is what I think is probably going to be most critical, and to move away from these short-term windows and kind of more eye candy science, and but have this really strong baseline of information and data. And we have a really good example of that in the H.J. Andrews Research Forest as well. That's been a collaborative process with the U.S. Forest Service and OSU, now going on multiple decades, started in about the 1950s. And so we're looking at 70 years of collaborative, cooperative, integrative research that serves a little different purpose than the Elliott, but is a really good benchmark to where we're headed.
Well, thank you, everyone. We will now move on to audience questions. Steve?
Thank you, Emily. So, first, just by way of full disclosure, I'm almost like a forest addict. I love the Mac-Dunn Forest. So those of you that are doing things to maintain that forest, thank you so much. It's made a huge difference in my life. I love having it here as a center. For me, it's a centerpiece of the community. And I don't think I'm overstating that at all. I know a lot of people feel quite the same way. So thanks for all the maintenance, which also mystifies me. So I don't know if this goes on in a national forest. I don't think so. I'm pretty sure it doesn't. I have noticed that there will be a down tree on a Tuesday, and if I'm back on a Thursday, same trail, that tree is been cut and is off the trail. It is a mystery to me how you folks do that and do it so quickly. How does that happen?
Well, I'll take that one. It is all hands on deck kind of a thing. And there's only a limited number of folks that actually are trained in chainsaw use, myself and two others. And we have student workers that help us as well as volunteers. But usually we make a list of all the trees that are down on all the roads. And the first priority is to remove trees on the roads for access. And then from there, we work out to trees that are on trails. And I have to say that all our trail users have been really helpful in pinpointing where they are. We had one gentleman who actually GPSed every tree on a trail that he had come across and had to walk over and sent that file to us. And so that goes on our list. And then we have a big list of all the roads, which ones are still plugged, which roads and trails, which ones are still plugged, and which ones are freed up. And so we kind of go through it methodically. And this year was kind of interesting because we had a storm in December. We had just gotten all that cleared. Maybe we had 2 weeks of quote free time, and then bam, we got hit again. And so it was just another month trying to get things finally cleared from that second storm. So it's a huge amount of work. So that's
was that during one of the snowstorms that gentleman with the GPS?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah. It was the second storm. Yeah.
I remember going up to 36 after one of those, and I'm like, it's just like, well, it was a good workout.
Yeah, I mean, if there are actually some trees, I should preface that if there's some trees that are extremely dangerous, we hit those first, whether they're on a trail or a road. So we'll assess those and then get a plan to take those down and get the high hazard trees down first. Then we look at roads, then we look at trails.
Now, you can't always fix everything super quickly. I know that the 610 has had a slope failure. At this point, there's no plan. Is there? It's really a plan to try to form a plan once it dries out. Is that the case?
The plan is to let it stabilize.
Mm-hmm.
We've had both our faculty in classes as well as geotech specialists from Oregon Department of Forestry out to look at it. It's a geologic issue where we have this clay and you have water that's pumping out and creating pressure, and it just pushes it out. So right now that road is not usable, and in order to build it back up, we'll have to find a something stable down below the clay, but we can't get down there yet because it's wet.
Right.
And so we're gonna wait for all that to dry out, and kind of then start probing and looking for a substrate that we can then anchor to and then build the road back up again.
And then, I guess, is there any kind of a timeline for that, or?
I don't think that'll be done this year.
Okay. And then, and I'm going to stick with recreation use for a moment. People don't seem to know about the website in terms of looking for closures. One of the things we're getting a lot of, well, things are closed, why don't you do something to let folks know? You folks do post closures on your website. I don't know how far ahead of time. So could you just talk about how folks can access that?
Yeah, so the first thing is if they're not receiving, if they're not on our listserv, then they're not getting our Facebook posts, our newsletter, or our forest updates. And so that's where we post the closures, you know, and we'll post those ahead of time, and we'll note how long the closure will be. There'll be a map that shows the route around the closure. We also, on all the kiosks leading into a closure, there'll be a map, and it'll be flagged. There's flagging around it, and it'll have a map showing the closure and the routes around it. So if they're not plugged in electronically, they go to the trailhead, and if they read it at the kiosk, then they'll become aware of it there.
Now, to sign up for the listserv, people would go over to the website, I'm assuming.
They could, if they're on the listserv, they'll get the updates automatically right to them.
Right, but what I'm saying is to get on the listserv.
Oh, yeah, they can go
Yeah.
through our website, or they can email me, and I'll get them contacted. We'll get them all signed up.
And yeah, you just Google OSU College of Forestry, and you'll be to the website, nothing flat.
Yeah,
Okay, great.
the research forest.
Yeah, okay, good. Only takes a minute to kind of figure out the navigation there. Okay, and
I would
then-
agree. It takes a little bit to figure out navigation. And I would
yeah.
say for the whole OSU site, not just ours.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And honestly speaking, I promise, it's easy to get used to. Okay, and then we're getting well. Yeah, let me stay on recreation before we get to this other kind of management. Parking. A lot of comments about parking. This particular viewer really unhappy about what happened with Oak Creek. The feeling being you folks were all set to build more parking than what you did. The neighborhood said no, and the community as a whole sort of lost in that balance, is the feeling from this particular viewer.
Yeah.
Just a little history. What had originally been the plan, and what wound up getting built in terms of parking spaces there?
So we went through to do recreation improvements in lands that are designated as resource lands. I mean, you just can't build trails or parking lots or recreation. It's a conditional use. So you have to go through a planning process.
Right.
So in that planning process, we did talk about potentially expanding Oak Creek a little bit, not much, maybe by 6 or 8 parking spots, and also improving it so that currently it has a wraparound rather than the back in and back out kind of thing.
Right.
Because of, and then we looked at maybe an alternative in addition to that parking lot, another additional parking space area out by the sheep farm, and which is the College of Ag. And after going through, myself and the prior recreation manager spent 3 months researching that, and given that area and the neighbors in that other potential parking area, as well as Benton County Public Works, is that spot wasn't going to work. And of course, the neighbors, and that spot around the sheep farm didn't want it. So all of a sudden now you've got neighbors against neighbors, like, you know, so we did not pursue expansion of that parking lot. Because of the influx of folks and our ability to manage all those people, is that building more parking lots is not the solution. We're not going to be able to accommodate everybody. And in fact, the forest can't accommodate everybody. So the parking lots in many ways will be the limiting factor, and people are going to have to plan for coming out. And we do have for Oak Creek, we have a webcam that people can view and look to see if the parking, how the parking is faring, whether it's open, whether it's full, and then jump on out there so they can catch it in different times when there's
And
less.
how often is the camera update, or is it in real time?
It's in real time.
Okay, great.
It was like every minute or so. So yeah.
There we go. Okay, good.
Yeah.
And then
just one of the improvements that we made there was a point where in some cases the neighbors, there's 80 cars down the road and they're parking on people's property, turn around in their driveways. And so in order to create order out of chaos through the conditional use permitting process, we installed bollards to keep people from doing that. And that has helped a lot. Now, some people still violate it and they may get a ticket if they're caught by the sheriffs, or they'll get a little note from us if our students see it and put it on their windshield that they're parking in an illegal spot.
And then as far as, so no current plan to expand parking there. Any plans to expand parking elsewhere, say the Saddle or?
The saddle we expanded quite a bit, and there still is curb, but you can still park within the fog line. There's still quite a bit of parking there. There's no plans to increase parking at the Dunn. And the reason for that is the Dunn is the objective for the recreation of the Dunn is for a more remote experience. Whereas the McDonald is that kind of quick, go out there for half hour, an hour, get my walk in and then head home.
Can't spend just a half an hour.
I know. I know. Once you get out there, you get sucked in, and so
yeah, you're there. Yeah, you're there all day. That's it. Okay, and I guess the other question is, you know, it's been suggested maybe there'll be like what I know is going on with state parks, day use permitting. Is that something the university is considering or considering?
No, not at all. In fact, as Tom said, that limits people, and we're not going to limit people. We want more people of all cultures and social and economic backgrounds to enjoy the forest. So, and to collect fees, you got to hire somebody to do that. And just you're talking, it doesn't pencil out, and it's not. It's an equity and justice issue. So,
right now, even if it were free, folks would have to have internet access, I suppose, is the other reason you folks aren't moving to that, or
internet access. What? I'm not sure I follow.
So for folks to arrange permitting, even if permits were free, you'd have to assure that folks have access to the website.
And you have to have a body to manage all that.
Right. Okay. And then okay, got it. And then other than that, I do know that there's still some vague, how should I say this? Well, there's been some questions about the interaction between bikes, hikers, runners, horses. I'm just whoever would like to speak to that etiquette.
Yeah, I mean, you always have that in any place you go. I mean, ours is regulated. We get, sometimes we'll get a hiker who gets startled by some mountain bikers who might be rude, and vice versa. Or startle horses. And so those are, at least from what we hear, are relatively rare, but they do happen. And I suspect more happens that we're not aware of. We also get interactions between dogs with dogs, or dogs with people. And, I had dogs but everybody has a right not to have a dog come up to them. And so even though your dog may be friendly, when you come up in the parking lot and you're near other people, the dog needs to be leashed until you get out, and it needs to be under voice command 100% of the time.
Yeah, fair amount of posting on social media for lost dogs. I don't know if you keep any numbers.
We don't, but when they send them to us, I usually, like for me, if they send a picture, I have a picture in my truck. So if I see the dog and I know the name, I can call the dog. So we've located dogs for people that way.
Yeah, okay, good. And then anything else to be said about etiquette between folks on the trails?
Well, people just need to be respectful of one another, and with that many people, people are come in contact with one another, and it's, be nice. I mean, that's all I can say. Be nice.
I jump in just a second, and this goes to both Steves here. I'm also a part of the Recreation Advisory Group on McDonald Dunn Forest. And it's a great group of people and represents primary users on the forest for recreation. But being a 40+ year resident of Corvallis and using the forest that whole time, it is absolutely remarkable how little conflict there is amongst people on McDonald and Dunn for that matter. But McDonald, where you see the much heavier use, it's really amazing. I've also got a background in recreation management with the U.S. Forest Service, and if the U.S. Forest Service had as many people who were willing to get along with each other in some semi-crowded situations as McDonald Dunn Forest would have been, my job would have been much easier there. So it's really a remarkable community. It's a community effort.
And I will say my experience has been you're nice, they're nice back. Everybody's, in a place where they're happy to be. Okay, let's talk wildfire prevention. I've got a number of questions about wildfire prevention. What's happening in terms of what does the forest do to prevent the kinds of wildfires we've seen in other places? First, and then next, is there some specific planning in place for suppression?
Yeah.
Who wants to lead with that one?
Let me lead with that, because so when I came to the forest in 2013, we had no plans for fire fuel reduction, because our forest back then didn't burn, right? I'm just kidding. Fire was not on everybody's mind, and it wasn't addressed in our 2005 forest plan either. There isn't anything on wildfire. And I have a fire background, so when I came on, and then we had the Timber Hill fire that just scared the heck out of me, because I was up on the hill at 2 a.m. with fire apparatus waiting for embers to come down on the forest. Fortunately, we didn't, because we're all uphill from everyone else. And so there's a lot of things that go on, activities that fire can move up into the forest and then move back towards the community. But since then, we do have a fire suppression plan. In fact, I just was reviewing it yesterday, and over at ODF for their review. So we have a plan for suppression if a fire were to occur on the forest. And then I also have a fire risk and fuel reduction policy. It's an illustrated guide so that we can target different places for fuel reduction. So we've right now we're doing some work, meadow restoration and fuel reduction in the Jackson Creek, Jackson Meadow area. We did a thinning last year to increase fire resistance and shaded fuel breaks. Earlier this spring, we did a mastication out at Oak Creek. And we've done other treatments at Oak Creek over the last several years. So I have a student coming on board this fall that will take that and develop a plan, a fire risk fuel plan that will go into our new plan once it's done. So the new plan that we come out with at the end of 2023 will address fire and fire fuel reduction in much greater detail.
Okay, and then my understanding is some of the harvesting that goes on is strategic. Is that the case?
Yeah, yeah, we'll use like thinning or other treatments to break up what we call the continuity of fuels, both horizontally and vertically, so that a fire may get up into the crowns, but then it comes into another condition where it really has to drop back down to the ground because there's nothing to sustain it up in the canopy.
Does anybody else have anything to add on wildfire?
Yeah, I'd jump in just for a sec here,
Please.
Steve, and just sort of back up a little bit and acknowledge that, as we look at the Willamette Valley and we look up into these foothills of the coastal range, there's all this historic oak savanna, which tells you fire was definitely a part of these landscapes in the past. And indigenous peoples of this region maintain their landscapes using fire, expert users of fire over millennia. And when Europeans arrived, I think there's a lot of assumptions about, well, especially because the last, prior to the late 1980s, the prior 60 years was a fairly cool, wet period, and people just came to assume that there wouldn't be fire on the west side of the Cascades and up here in the coastal range. And there's been a great expansion in this part of the Willamette of Douglas fir into what had been historically oak savanna. And so I think the message is that historically fire was absolutely a part of these landscapes. And climate change is bringing that right back into focus again, because we have longer, hotter, drier fire seasons here in this region than we did 30 years ago. And so, as Fitz said, we are adjusting our management plans accordingly. And we're doing some different things. Fitz, you might talk just a little bit about some of the oak savanna work that you're doing and reestablishing some of these open landscapes and in areas in the forest.
Yeah. So just to comment on what Tom just said, land use is also the problem. So you've got land use allowing people to build out into or adjacent to not just our forest, but other forests. And they haven't done any fuel reduction to reduce their risk. There are places on our forest where because it's a research project, we're not going to do any fuel reduction because the allocation is already set for research. But as Tom mentioned, we're trying to what we call build back some of these historic landscapes. So where we have oak and removing conifers that have invaded, and that creates it reestablishes the oak savanna, and that structure also reduces the continuity of fuel, and it gives us some breaks so that along with our other harvests, these oak restoration areas create a buffer or make it it's more difficult for fire to kind of move through, at least through in a canopy through that type of forest. We have an oak, like I said, an oak restoration going on both on the Dunn Forest and out at Jackson Creek Meadow, as well as reestablishing the meadow itself, which has quite a bit of invasives in it. So trying to actually reestablish gaps and openings across our forest is an important strategy, not only for our forest, but even across. I used to work on the east side as well, as those forests have become dense, and trying to open those up so that fire has less chance of moving up into the crowns and then moving horizontally. It just stays on the ground and burns at an intensity that's kind of more at a historic severity.
In a few minutes, we're going to move over to the Elliott, but let's stay on the Mac-Dunn for a moment. I'd like to move over to Tom DeLuca for this. First, in terms of forestry programs in general, university forestry programs, are there other programs comparable nationally to the one at OSU?
Yeah, absolutely. There are forestry schools, there are forestry colleges at different universities around the nation. I personally worked at two other forestry programs in the nation, University of Washington and at University of Montana, and also received degrees at a couple others, Wisconsin, Iowa State. The University of Montana has an experimental forest about 35 minutes north and east of Missoula. It's a 20 some thousand acre ponderosa pine, Doug fir, and lodgepole forest. And but it's, you know, it's a bit of a drive from campus. And then at Washington we had Pack Forest, which is a roughly 6,000 acre forest south and east of Seattle by about 90 minutes. So one of the really special things about the McDonald Dunn is it's right in town. I mean, our students could literally walk from campus to our forest if they wanted to, and that's really special. There's very few programs around the nation that have that, you know, that have that opportunity.
Are there actually any that do? And look at the
only very small forests, not you know, 10,000 acres, 11,000 acres of forest like the McDonald Dunn. There's some programs that have some small forest tracts that are close to town, but nothing like that. And none that I, you know, that come right to mind. I think, you know, something like Stephen F. Austin has a forest that's right near town, but
NAU does too, I think.
Yeah, NAU has a forest close to town.
But NAU, which is
Northern Arizona University. So there's some, but it is a special aspect of the McDonald Dunn. And yeah.
Okay, and so from the standpoint of nationally, it's kind of a standalone program or a standout program in a number of ways.
Yes, the College of Forestry is absolutely it. First of all, it's really a full service College of Forestry in terms of the degree programs that are available here, both within the college and affiliated with other colleges within the university, such as, you know, we have direct links with engineering, College of Engineering through our forest engineering, civil engineering program. We have really close links with the College of Ag and with their wildlife program. And so there's a number of examples of that, but we provide a really wide breadth of offerings within the natural resources as a whole, and then really a great deal of depth, history, and capacity in the forest sciences and forest management realm, as well as wood science. We have both the forestry and forest production, as well as the wood products, and across a gamut of wood products, everything from you know, traditional milling of wood products to alternative materials generated from forest, and both chemicals as well as different fiber products. And so and then we also, as I had said earlier, address this really broad gamut of natural resource management and recreation management affiliated with the forest. And I'll say one other thing, just that Holly can pick up and run with. Something really special about this College of Forestry is our extension program. We have a really, really strong natural resource extension program, probably the best in the nation. And that allows us to reach all corners of the state with natural resources, in, you know, education for as Holly said, non-tuition students.
Why don't we go ahead and let Holly speak to the extension program for a moment, and then I want to move over to harvesting, because I've got a number of questions from viewers on harvesting.
Great.
Sure. So yeah, I'll just pick up on what Tom just shared, in that the extension forestry program that we've got at OSU is considered really the best in the country. It's the largest. We've got about 30 faculty and staff that work at various levels within Extension. So we've got folks spread all across the state. Some of our faculty are responsible for a single county or 2 counties or 3 counties. And then we've got a whole team of people who work specifically on wildfire risk reduction. And so we've got 6 people who are responsible for a section of the state each. And when we go back to what Fitz was talking about, the fact that we have 10 different research tracks all across the state, each of those research tracks can function as a demonstration site for our extension faculty to be teaching local folks. We were talking about how down at the Elliott, the conditions are different because it's so steep, different kind of soils. And so the what we convey in educational events down there could be slightly different than what we want to convey when we're here in the valley versus what we would convey when we're over on the eastern Oregon. And so having these research tracks all across the state is really helpful in terms of providing demonstration and outreach opportunities that are relevant to the local folks in each of those areas.
Anybody else on extension? Okay, let's move over to harvesting. And, you know, I guess we'll start with the one that there's been some angst about. Some years back, an individual from the community pointed out that a stand of trees, of old growth trees, had been harvested, 100-year or more old trees. One of them being, I think, if memory serves, a 400-year-old tree. Is that correct that happened?
It's correct that a 400-year-old tree was cut. It was not an old growth forest. It had some old trees in it, but yeah.
Okay. And was that intentional or was it an error?
No, that was well, it wasn't intentional to cut a 400-year-old tree. We left old trees and we cut some old trees. And so that one happened to be 400 years old. So we didn't know the age of that tree at the time.
Now, since that
Because
time,
we normally don't age the trees because it's difficult when they're that big, and size doesn't always equate to age. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But
and then as things been put into place, this is not the practice of the forest, am I correct? Or the program?
no, what we put in place until this new plan is that we try to identify trees that are approximately 160 years or older, and we mark those trees to be left. And so we use some technology to help us find those using LiDAR to look at extraordinary large trees. And then we can navigate, once we know where they are, where we might be planning a harvest, then we can navigate to those trees and then core them to get an age, although sometimes we can't core all the way to the center because our increment cores, like these trees behind me, I don't have an increment core that goes to the center of those trees. However, if I core it and I get, even if I'm not to the center, it's 160 years old, I know it's older than 160. So what we've been able to identify those, do a better job of identifying those trees and then utilizing them by leaving those as structure within the harvest unit and for habitat.
And then I guess the other piece of this is there are folks that believe that there shouldn't be any harvesting going on in the forest.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess one, how do you answer to that? And then we're going to kind of maybe discuss the role of the timber industry within the program at OSU.
Well, I think with that question, you live in a vacuum. I mean, we look in life, we look at a sustainable harvest that has to balance kind of the environmental, social, and economic. And so nothing's free. I mean, it does cost money to manage the forest. So there's a certain amount of that has to happen. And that's for anybody. I mean, unless you got personally deep pockets where you had your own forest and you had deep pockets, you didn't have to harvest any trees, that's great, but most people don't. And so some level of management and harvest is necessary. And under land use, this is resource land. So it's that protects and maintains resource lands that prevent from getting broken up and then become both ecologically and economically unusable for society. So other than for home tracks. That's what we're trying to do is, and I know that everybody here, both on the call and probably those in the audience, if I brought you all out to the forest and said, this is yours, how would you manage it? Each of us would take a different approach based on our values. And I often tell forestry students, when you think about forestry and all the disciplines, forestry is an integrated science. The most important science in forestry is social science, because it is people that determine how forests should be managed, and that's based on values. So that it's important that each of us would take a different approach. So when people say those things, it's fine, because I actually do think about all of those comments, and of course thinking about the new plan, that those are important. So I welcome those different views. They're helpful, actually.
And Steve, if I may, I would
Please.
just like to mention that we do have a vision and mission for all of our research forests. So just about a year and a half ago, Tom DeLuca asked for a group of faculty and staff internally to develop a vision and a mission that governs our research forests. And the vision is that they serve as a model for actively and sustainably managed forests. And timber harvest is part of that active forest management. So it's got to be in there as part of the vision for what we do on these forests.
Then Tom, I'm going to ask, how much are there timber industry funded? Is the program doing any timber industry funded research at this point?
Is there any timber industry funded research within the college?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Yeah, yes, there is. We have a number of co-ops that are joint efforts between the college and industry partners, and as well as agency partners that work together on specific areas of interest, whether it's Swiss needle cast or other, specific pest problem, whether it's on wood preservatives or whether it's on intensive forest management or tree improvement. There's different co-ops that exist within the college that are partly industry supported. Industry also has provided resources for research directly within the college in terms of both endowments or gifts to the college, and have funded research projects. The majority of research funding that is received within the college comes from state and federal sources in terms of USDA, NSF, USGS, etc.
And then about what percentage of research through the college is being funded by the industry?
I would ask our research associate dean if she has that number on the tip of her tongue.
An approximation would be fine. If you got precision, that'd be even better.
I guess from just an approximation, the co-ops that Tom mentioned, which are a mixture of agencies and private forests, they probably bring in a little over $1 million a year. Again, that's mixed funding between those two entities. And then the rest of our portfolio, which can go up as high as 10 million, is a lot of it is USDA, USGS, the National Science Foundation, NOAA, Nature Conservancy. We just have a whole host of others. So I would say it's probably, on a very rough guess, less than 20%, but it probably could go as low as 10%. That's funded directly from industry. And then there are targeted programs we have too that that we could get into too, in terms of the harvest tax. I don't know if we want to go there or not, but that's,
Okay, and then I guess the other piece of this is that there is a question here in terms of, does the dollars that are coming in for research from the timber industry, do they influence the research? Do they influence the teaching? What's taught? Tom.
So if you're asking if does the source of money influence the outcomes of science, the answer is no. We are charged with conducting science, which is the independent and exploration of asking questions based on building our scientific knowledge based on inquiry. And it's not if we were to bias our science based on the source of revenue, no one would give us money anymore for our research. So in other words, if we just conducted research that gave the answers that a specific entity wanted, we would lose our relevance as recognition as an independent science-driven institution of higher education. And that's why we're here. And so the answer to your question in the short is no, we are not influenced by the, in terms of the outcomes of the research, by the source of funding from which it comes.
Okay, I think we've got it. I'm going to move over to the Elliot now. And I think, Katie, I would like to start with you if I could. You shared about the Elliot opportunity coming along just as there's new sensing technologies. I think it was you that had mentioned that. And that really opens up still even further opportunity in terms of research. Can you unwrap some of that for our audience?
sure. One example, we were just out on the Elliot twice in the last week, and the first trip that we went out, one of our researchers brought along with him a new instrument that is LIDAR based, and LIDAR shoots basically light beams out that bounce back, and the timing of the leaving and bouncing back kind of maps in a three-dimensional way what you're walking through or flying over, depending on what type of a platform you have. And so in this very simple walk with this very simple instrument, 4 days later, this person pops up with basically a image of the forest we just walked through that's three-dimensional, can be rotated, can measure the diameter, the height to the live crown, the size of every branch on that tree, get total height of that tree. We can get the amount of down wood on the forest floor. We can get the understory and the structure of the understory. So in that, we just got a picture and a numerical representation of that forest that allows us to collect data at a depth and breadth that we've never been able to in forestry. So we've always had to estimate everything, and now we can truly quantify it, which is sounds minor maybe to some of you out there, like what's she so excited about? But in a world where we live with uncertainty, we just erased a lot of uncertainty and increased our ability to really characterize what a forest looks like. And I think that if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a LIDAR image is worth a novel. It's Gone with the Wind or whatever. It's truly a breakthrough in terms of what we can do in forestry and how we can think about it. So that's just one example. Another example is we're getting into acoustic detectors, sound in a forest. Right, we're all there mostly because of the silence. Well, there's not silence in a forest. There are sounds, in it, whether it's birds or whatever. But we're now starting to think about soundscapes in a forest and what they tell us about the diversity. The diversity of bird calls can tell you a lot about the diversity of the birds that are in that forest in a way that we can measure it now 24/7 rather than just getting snapshots when a wonderful scientist, and Holly could even talk better about this because she's worked on acoustic detecting of bats. And so there's just, these breakthroughs are really going to really change the way we can look at our forests and measure them in the future. And so it can give us much more precision to what we plan to do. We can now fly over a forest, map out regeneration, and rather than just broadcast herbicides, we can say, you know, we just have to go to that one quadrant, that one, you know, 3 or 4 acre piece, not the whole 40 acres. So we can be much more precise in what our management is and what our activities are. So
thanks. And Shannon, for you, this opens up some possibility as well. And you've talked about some of the possibilities with the Elliott. And I think that we had discussed at one point that so much of the research that's done now is around correlation rather than mechanistic process. Can you describe what you're looking forward to with the Elliott in those terms as a research forest?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Katie said earlier, one of the really exciting things for the Elliott as a research forest is the fact that it's a long-term research program. So it allows for true integration across the research that's happening across the forest at different spatial and temporal scales. It allows for collaboration, in the short term and the long term. And so I think that's one of the other, really exciting pieces is there's so many people in Oregon who will have the opportunity to be part of the research there, as well as across the country and across the world. And so, having that ability to collaborate, to share ideas, to ask new questions, to think about some of the challenges that Tom was mentioning earlier, and how we can ask those questions with the technology that we have is a really exciting piece of this forest. And it also sort of gets to extension as well. The education opportunities for the Elliott are just huge, and it's part of the conversations that went into the development of the research proposal, as well as the management plan and future plans for the forest, that there's close connections with local communities and K through 12 schools. There's connections with colleges, with community colleges, with other universities. So there's more formal opportunities, but there's also opportunities for informal education for members of the public, for partnerships with extension, and that goes both ways. It also, those types of interactions allow researchers to understand what the questions are that are important to land managers and to society out there, and start to think about how that kind of weaves into the research that they're doing.
And dialing back to kind of the way society interacts with the forest, the Elliott specifically, has there been some interaction with the community already? And maybe Ken, you can also weigh in on this. Has there been some interaction with the neighboring communities in that area that they've expressed some desires that would telegraph to our audience some of what is planned or what may be planned for that forest, the Elliott?
Just real briefly, I'd say we've definitely had a couple of open houses, well, not just a couple, but several open houses in the communities, primarily Coos Bay, Reedsport
But
area.
you're breaking up just a little bit there, Ken.
Sorry. We've had open houses and plenty of opportunities for folks to engage, particularly in the Reedsport, Coos Bay area. And one of the key elements in the planning that's been part of the guiding principles for the advisory committee since day one is that it's really important that we do have community engagement. And it's also really important that the overall working forest concept helps to create jobs within the communities that are local to the forest. The Elliott is, it's quite frankly a fairly remote place, and it's as we said earlier, some intimidating topography would be a good way to put that. And I spent many years in the Coast Range, and it is intimidating, but it's really a key that the communities there are involved. And there's a very direct line within planning that Shannon will do and the work that Katie and others have done in the background and the formation of this, the design here to engage the community and put the facilities that would relate to the research on the forest and the facilities that would relate to recreation on the forest within the communities, where the communities can have a real feeling of connection to the forest. And then from there, we can spread out to the rest of the known world, being Oregon. And then with the results of research, it literally worldwide implications. So Shannon, I'll leave it with you or Katie.
I just want to think one more thing about the communities we've engaged with and will continue to engage with. And the other one is the tribal communities. They've been a large part of the planning process. They've been a large part of they'll be a part of the management as well. We've been already writing grant proposals directly involving the local tribal nations, the sovereign nations, many of whom were the initial inhabitants of the Elliott. So we're very aware of that too as a key part of the Elliott plan. So going forward, and so that's one other piece that's important.
And I'm going to ask you to unfairly answer this in about a minute for each forest. Shannon, I don't know why I think I should ask you. We might have this wrong. Endangered species in the Elliott. What's being done to which species are endangered in the Elliott? What's being done to protect them?
So I think as Ken mentioned earlier, part of the process that we're currently in with the Elliott State Research Forest is the development of a habitat conservation plan. And so that plan is currently under agency review, but it covers 3 species, specifically northern spotted owl, marbled murrelet, and then Oregon coast coho. Another piece of the forest management plan is looking at a multi-species conservation strategy. So the habitat conservation plan focuses on those 3 species in particular, and the research and management of the forest will integrate very closely with the information that's laid out in the HCP and the direction. But then there's also, of course, with the research and the monitoring that's going on in the forest, a conservation strategy related to species that are not specifically named in that HCP.
Okay, and then again, and I don't know if you would know this or not, but I don't know do we have endangered species in the Mack forest that we're paying attention to? Somebody in the back, Holly, why don't I ask you?
Unfortunately, Fitz is the one who is best prepared to answer that question. We did have northern spotted owl years ago. I think it's been something like 10 years since they were last detected in the McDonald Dunn. There may be some rare plants. I don't know that there's any that are endangered, but I know that there are some that are imperiled and rare.
Fitz, do you have anything to add to that? Or sorry, I think he's out. Fitz is picking up his wife from the airport, yeah. So he had to leave early. Okay, and then the next question is the last question. I'm just going to selfishly take prerogative really quickly, but I know a lot of our viewers want to know any new trails planned for the Mack Forest. Oh, Holly, I'm going to start with you.
Again, Fitz or Steve Fitzgerald is the one who would be best prepared to answer that question. Tom, do you happen to know?
Yeah, do you happen
to know? It's my understanding that there are additional trails planned for the Mac-Dunn. There are work in progress with our partner organization, Team Dirt, for mountain bike trails. I can't speak specifically to what's planned right now. And of course, with the forest management plan that's forthcoming, additional trail planning will be included in that effort as well.
Okay, well, I appreciate you taking time with us this evening. It is just about 8 o'clock. You've probably had long days. I appreciate all that you do in the area forest. Obviously, I'm a fan of the recreational aspect of the forest. So thank you so much for that. And I'm going to turn it back over to Emily.
Thanks, Steve. And of course, we want to extend a big thanks to our Corvallis Advocate staff and all of the work they do behind the scenes that make these City Speak town halls possible. And again, thanks to Peak Sports and First Alternative Natural Foods Co-op for also helping to make this series possible. And of course, we can't do these forums without help from viewers like you. So please do subscribe if you haven't already.